COOGS House. All right, now that we beat Memphis and that's behind us, let's get on to the team that's actually number 2 in the conference. Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth, here to break down all things Cougs. If you're a U of H fan or just a hater who came to stop by, please be sure to hit subscribe down below. That way you can listen to Cougs in your newsfeed each and every day. We appreciate you making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. Welcome back to the YouTube channel. It's good to see you again. Remember, we're fast approaching 750 subscribers. We're at just under 675 right now. So hit the subscribe button to help us get to 750. Every 250, we are giving away something. Remember, this time we're going to give away one of those Galen Robinson designed Letterman jackets once we get there. So A, hit subscribe down below, make sure we get there. And B, comment and like the videos to make sure we know that you're entered and want to win. If after listening to this preview of the Houston and Tulsa rematch on Wednesday night, you don't know what to say, you don't really want to talk about basketball or whatever, tell us, yesterday it was how you cook an egg. So tell us in this one if it's acceptable to put ketchup on eggs. Now, in this, we're going to kind of break it down in 3 segments. In the first segment, we're talking about how Tulane has looked since the last Houston matchup, because frankly, they've looked really good. That's not the whole segment, though, I promise. The second segment, we're going to look at, what did that last matchup tell us? And, how could that shed light on what could come in this one? And the third segment, I did a lot of listening to Kelvin Sampson and his availabilities on Monday and Tuesday, and I just want to share some insights and highlights of that. Not a whole lot about the Tulane game necessarily, and also not a whole lot about the Memphis game necessarily from Sunday, but a lot of stuff that Kelvin Sampson had to say. But first, let's talk some about Tulane. Now, since Houston played Tulane, the Tulane Green Wave have gone 5-1. Admittedly, 4 of those games were overtime games. They were, I believe, if I'm counting this right, 3-1 in overtime in that stretch. The loss was by 2 points at Tulsa immediately after the Houston game. Kind of a disappointing loss, you'd think, based on where Tulsa currently sits in the conference. Their wins were in overtime by 5 against Wichita State, a single point against Memphis, yes, the same Memphis, and they won by 7 against Cincinnati. Worth mentioning, aside from the fact that those are wins over good programs, they did have 1 game postponed in that stretch. They were scheduled to play East Carolina. East Carolina commentator, play-by-play guy, Jeff Charles, passed away while on the road trip, and they postponed that game. I have not seen anything as far as making that up. I imagine if it played some role in the standings at the end of the season, there might be some way to figure that out with a coin flip or a forfeiture or something. But right now, that was just, at the moment, that was the kind of thing where things were bigger than basketball, right? So that game got postponed, so Tulane should have played 7 games, but they played 6. Jalen Cook, who Houston held to 15 in their matchup with Tulane on January 17th, has had 20 or more points in every single Tulane game since, including 30 points in their big win over South Florida. That was also one of 2 non-overtime games. That was a, what is that, if I'm doing my math right, 18-point win over South Florida that they had. Jaylen Forbes, the guy who had a really good game against Houston, he had 23 against Houston, had a down game his very next game in their loss against Tulsa. You could argue probably the reason they lost is they lost in overtime and he only had 8 points. However, he's had more than 15 points in every game since that one. Kevin Cross continues to be a very versatile scorer for them. They're using a lot of the same actions they're using him before Houston. The only real shift in a lineup or X's and O's aspect that they've had is recently they put Tylan Pope in for RJ McGee. Now, Tylan Pope is a 6'5" defender type. RJ McGee is probably a 6'4", and he is a 6'4"-ish guy, but is probably a better shooter than Tylan Pope. But they made that move in the SMU game recently, which was the other non-overtime game they've played. They beat SMU by 22. They probably made that move, though, I would assume, because Pope is a better defender. And with Cook, Forbes, and Cross, they don't necessarily need the shots in the same kind of way. They need guys that can help cover up the back end when someone blows by and gets in the lane and those kinds of things, trying to shore the defense up. Now, McGee and Pope, Pope was in the rotation before. McGee is in the rotation now. It's just interesting to see them work around that. As I open with, Tulane is second place in the conference. They're a solid game ahead of Memphis, who's in third. Houston's in this weird spot where if they continue to win basketball games, the rematch with Memphis might be a game they don't need to have outside of like just general seeding at the end of the regular season, because they could lock up the conference with a couple wins today, next weekend, and next week. So interesting spot to look at there. I will say, though, that when there were moments that Houston struggled against Memphis without Kendrick Davis on the floor, now we talked on Monday, you and I did, obviously, there were moments that that wouldn't necessarily mattered a whole lot. But I also think it's worth pointing out that this is a better team than that. And this is a team that's played a really good basketball as of late and has won close games. Now, the pessimist in me would point out that, hey, if they're 3-1 in overtime games since, there's a not so crazy world that they could also be 1-3 in overtime games since, and it seems like they're playing really bad basketball. So I understand that goes both ways, but there's something to be said about winning those close games. Remember, this is a team, and we talked about some on the preview of the first game, but they have 3 Power 5 transfers in their starting 5, all of Forbes, Cook, and Cross, the 3 leading scorers as well. Jaylen Forbes transferred in from Alabama. Jalen Cook transferred in from LSU, and Kevin Cross came in from Nebraska. That's 3 Power 5 guys starting 5. And so if Houston's going to liken themselves to being a Power 5 team because they're moving in the Big 12 next year, and because they'll be competing with them, hopefully, in the later stages of the March Madness tournament in a few weeks, obviously this is the kind of game that's a great matchup to kind of, prepare yourself for those kinds of things. Worth pointing out, they also have 2 guys in the rotation that get a decent amount of minutes. Colin Holloway started off at Georgetown. He's a Georgetown transfer. And then Trey Williams gets like 8 to 10 minutes a game. He started off at Minnesota, then went to Oregon State, and is now at Tulane. So guys in the rotation have played big-time basketball, and it's no accident that head coach Ron Hunter has this program heading in the right direction. Ron Hunter, remember, was at IUPUI when they had a guy named George Hill. Yes, that George Hill that's in the NBA now still went to IUPUI and played for Ron Hunter while he was there. Ron Hunter has had a successful coaching career and seems to be, in Kelvin Sampson's words, a program builder. It seems to be what he's doing at Tulane for sure right now. He's IUPUI and then Georgia State for a minute. At Georgia State, they won the Sun Belt tournament a couple times, and now is at Tulane, and frankly kind of has Tulane sized up to be the team that maybe steals this conference from Memphis after Houston, Cincinnati, and Central Florida exit, right? All 3 teams that I just mentioned are going to the Big 12 next year, and I think people assume it's Memphis's conference to lose in a lot of ways, but Ron Hunter is certainly poised and is currently situated in the second place in the conference to take over that mantra and that title. Now, Penny's got a bunch of recruits coming in, and how does Hunter deal with that? But that's for the American to figure out next year. We'll see them in the tournament if we see them. Same team as far as X and O's go. We'll talk more in the second segment specifically, but Tulane still gives up a lot of drop-offs to the dunker spot as people break in to the lane off the bounce. And then when they over-rotate on that, they give up a lot of kick-out threes. On the season, they're averaging 82 points per game, Tulane is, because they play the 5th fastest pace in all of college basketball. They shoot just 33.5% from 3, but they shoot 22.8 attempts per game because, again, they play the 5th fastest pace in basketball. For what it's worth, Houston is currently 348th in possessions per game, because if you think about it, those long possessions with a bunch of offensive rebounds count as a single possession. It gets broken up because of all that. Now, I want to talk about the first matchup and how that ties into things. But first, let's talk a little bit about our buddies at FanDuel. Now, FanDuel is the #1 sports book in America, and it is midway through the NBA season. It's the perfect time to download FanDuel because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. They can bet on everything from the money line to point scores to threes drained. This is the part where they tell you to like bet on pro basketball games. However, pro basketball games aren't quite back yet, and they've got a line for our Tulane Houston game. They've got Houston favored by 13.5 points, and the over-under set at 143.5. I'm taking Houston, I'm taking the line, and I'm taking the over. This game strikes me as more like an 84-68 kind of game, right? More than 13.5, and that adds up very quickly to more than the 143. I'm actually cutting it close. Let's call it 86. I see this being a 16 to 18 point margin, but Tulane scores a lot of points and push the pace a lot. So I see that margin happening in the like 80s and 60s. The 143.5 is right there at the line. I'm going to take the over. I'm thinking that might just be my entertainment. Like I'd like to see it go over, but on the whole, I really do feel like this is going to be more like in the 80s to in the 60s, not like in the 60s to in the 40s. And so I'm going to push for the over because by the time you play a free throw game and that kind of stuff at the end, that's what I think. I think it's going to be a higher scoring game than people realize. Again, Tulane scores 82.3 points per game this season. So holding them to 10 points less would still have them at 72 points, right? Do it at FanDuel. FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a bigger payout with same game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/locked-on. That's FanDuel.com/locked-on to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, so I said in this segment I'd do a little bit of looking at how that first matchup happened and like what went right for Houston in that one. Houston won by 20 points, 80-60 in Louisiana. And the first thing that jumped on the page when you pull that tape up is like, oh, right, this is the Marcus Sasser game. Marcus Sasser took over this game in the second half. You remember right before the half, it's a 12-point game. Houston's winning by 12. They're coming down. Jaylen Forbes has the ball. You can tell he's going to try and score and try and cut it to 10 or something like that. He steps back and pulls up for three and gets clocked by Tremont Mark for a foul and one three-pointer, cut the lead to 8. And frankly, the crowd erupts. It goes to halftime. It feels like, oh, God, this could be the kind of game where Houston loses. To that point, Houston had only lost to Alabama on the season, and it felt like, oh, this could be the same kind of blown lead that we'd seen happen in that game. However, they came out of the half. A lot of stuff was said at halftime. It sounds like about calming down, playing our game, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Marcus Sasser came in the next half and hit a three. They got to stop. He came down and hit another three. They got to stop. He came down on a fast break for a layup. Quickly, Sasser's 8 points forced Ron Hunter to call timeout at the 18:05 mark of the second half, right? Very quickly, that 8-point lead exploded to a 16-point lead, and Houston didn't really look back. Now, this was a high-scoring game. I mentioned Houston scored 80 points and gave up 60. And the reason it was such a high-scoring game is because Houston continued in the first half to get in the lane and drop the ball off to Juwan Roberts for his little dunker spot drop-offs, right? The same Mike and spot we talked about where he found himself so much in the Memphis game. He was just about a step or two further out at the dunker spot for this one. Juwan had 15 points in the game. 14 of those were in the first half because he continued to have drop-off after drop-off after drop-off. And as Steve Peters photos on Twitter, I think he's actually now COOGS Steve on Twitter. Anyway, as he pointed out last game, Houston is now 10-0 when Juwan Roberts has the first basket of the game. This was one of those games because Houston got in the lane and dropped it off, and Juwan Roberts had to put in, right? It was that kind of thing over and over because for some reason, and I know it's not Ron Hunter's coaching because I've seen his teams play this better, especially the George Hill IPOI teams that are fun in the tournament. But they're really easy to get by on the first bounce. The guy can penetrate the lane and force the rotation, at least Sasser and Mark and Arsenault a little bit in that game and Shed, and all of them can get guys off the bounce really, really quickly. Kind of pick your poison there. And then the big fella steps up. And when the big fella steps up, suddenly the Houston big fella behind him is open for business. Now, I do think that adding Tylan Pope, he's listed at 6'5". I wonder if he's a little bit longer than that watching some of their tape. I have to admit, I hadn't really thought much about him since the last matchup till I put them on. He's kind of a more rangy guy. In the first matchup, I was very concerned with Cyan James. He did not prove to be necessarily like a big-time scoring threat, but he was a big-time energy threat. And so do Tylan and Cyan end up becoming more like these perimeter stoppers to keep guys off the bounce for Houston? Maybe, but Houston's so much more athletic than many of these teams that Tulane has seen in these close matchups. I just don't know if they keep him out of lane. What they'll have to do, what I imagine they do, is while Houston will get some of those drop-offs to the bigs, you're going to have to do what they did to Houston in the second half, where they cut off the drop-off and give up the kick-out three. And I imagine they're going to hope Houston misses. And we've seen those games happen before. I mean, Houston went 3 of 17 on Sunday against Memphis, right? And when that happens, Houston's very vulnerable. That's an awful shooting performance, and sometimes the ball just didn't go in. It wasn't that they were bad shots or anything, but if that kind of thing happens, that's kind of what Tulane is hoping to get at this, and then get the rebound and run. That said, the way Marcus Sasser is so easily able to take over the second half of this game by just kind of dialing it up, I think you could see him dial it up from the jump on Wednesday, right? Now, I will say, as I pull this up, that Wednesday is kind of a cool night for the Houston Cougars because it's a blackout night, and you're hoping that everyone is they got a cool black T-shirt they're giving out. Everyone's going to put it on and be crazy and rowdy, even though it is we'll say late night. I think it's like an 8 o'clock tip off, a little late for most of us, but it's the kind of game that's going to be a lot of fun. So I hope that crowd really plays a difference in this one, because that energy from the jump could lead to that Marcus Sasser second half takeover happening out the gate. We run away with this thing. We don't ever look back. I will say, in the first matchup between these two teams, there was a stretch in the second half between the 16 and a half-ish minute mark and the 12 and 11 and a half minute mark, where Houston did not score a field goal. They had, I think, a couple good looks, but on the whole, they kind of got stagnant on offense again. We see this from time to time. The encouraging thing in that game was that it was very, very short-lived. However, Tulane can do that to Houston. They're not one of those teams that's incapable of doing that. They're not the kind of team that Houston's going to be able to do whatever they want to against. That Houston's going to be able to do whatever they want to against. I think what's interesting is in the first matchup, they went to a zone, and Houston had a lot of success hitting the guy at the nail. When I say the nail, I mean there's a literal nail on the floor you can look down and see at the middle of the free throw line in every basketball court in America, right? So when I say hit the nail, they're hitting a guy at the middle of the free throw line, 15 feet over from the basket, and Houston was able to get some high-low actions. Tremont Markets and middies in that range. I think Tremont had 10 in the first half, if I'm remembering correctly, right? Big, when they went to the zone, Houston got him out of it really fast. There are ways that you can cover up that nail pass, and I'm sure Ron Hunter has covered that up at practice since. And I could see them going to zone at different times if Houston is shooting the ball badly, to make Houston skip the ball across to try and force more long threes, because we know that Houston, because it's the kind of team where you feel like the next one's always going to go in, they're going to keep shooting those kick-out threes and those kinds of things. On the whole, though, I don't think Houston's going to have a whole lot of trouble scoring. It's going to be, can they score enough points? Because Tulane scores a lot of points. Houston going to have a great defensive showing and still give up 20 points to Forbes and 20 points to Cook. They're just that good. They're really, really quick, really, really shifty, change direction really, really well. And the first matchup, honestly, Cook had 15 points and didn't shoot the ball too well, right? Jaylen Forbes had 23 points, but kind of shot very average percentages, didn't go off for that, right? And so I feel like, in looking at the second matchup, there's a real chance that both guys are well into their into the 20s, and it's, does Houston keep the other guys from truly hurting it? Because none of the guys are going to get 50, right? But do they keep Kevin Cross from getting his own 16 to add to it? Do they, do they keep Cyan James into single digits instead of letting him get 12 hustle points on 6 baskets, right? Or Jaden Coleman, can they keep him kind of at bay because he's a low minute guy, or does he come in and light him up really quickly for a couple quick bats? Like, can they keep the other guys out of it? And like Forbes and Cook might cook a little bit. That was not on purpose, but Forbes and Cook might do well for a minute or two. They might get their 20 points, but Houston's going to be able to score a lot more than 44. So if they get 22 and 22, it's not the end of the world. I do hope we see, and it'd be really cool to see, Shed and Sasser take a little personally. There's no like online trash talk. Everyone knows who the best backcourt in America is. But I do think Jalen Cook and Jaylen Forbes kind of feel like they're in a similar class. And I don't mean to be like that guy that poops on Tulane. They're a very strong program. I got a lot of respect for what Ron Hunter's doing as a coach. Evidence, I've like pay attention to what he's doing, but they're not in the same class. They're just not. And so I feel like I said, this is going to be a mid 80s to mid 60s kind of basketball game. I could see if Tulane is shooting the ball well, this could be a mid 80s to more like a 70 kind of game. So we'll see where that goes. I hope the blackout crowd draws a lot of blood early. No, that's a saying though, right? Don't go fight anyone. But I think it'll be interesting to see how that works out. I don't know that schematically Houston has to change a whole lot what they do. There's nothing crazy, no tricks up their sleeve. And Tulane is playing well, but not doing things differently than they did before. So the matchup should still play out in a similar fashion if Houston can make their shots. Now, in the third segment, I want to talk a little bit about some media stuff that's happened the last couple of days for Houston that's gone really, really well. So let's talk a little bit about, let's talk first about Coach's radio show. And every Monday, Coach Sampson does a radio show in town. He takes questions from the crowd. They usually have a player come up and talk a little bit. And this one was Juwan Roberts. Talk a little bit about Trinidad. And Juwan is not like a very, he doesn't like talking to crowds. It didn't seem like, but it was interesting to hear. Frankly, they seem to always open up with a free throw joke because there's a funny clip from this radio show a few weeks ago where Kelvin Sampson is actually the one on the stand on the podium, and Kelvin Sampson asks him, posing as a fan, if Kellen could help work with those guys in their free throws because they're not very good at shooting free throws. The free throw joke opened up, but what I thought was interesting to hear from Kelvin Sampson is that they haven't changed much up in how they coach free throws. They're not like spending more time at practice or spending more time focusing on form or spending more time focused on like how to make them more game-like or whatever. They're just doing the same thing they've always been doing, and now the guys are making them. So in Kelvin Sampson's classic, like, now we look like geniuses kind of way, he was like, they just missed them earlier. They've been doing things the right way. They just missed the shots earlier in the season. I thought was interesting was in doing that, he said it's when you start making your free throws, you don't, quote, get those dumbass emails about why you don't practice your free throws. I thought that was really, really insightful and funny, and quite a moment from Sampson on that one. He also talked about how when they like script moments, they like pick out things in the game they want to get done very intentionally. So in this Tulane game, the first time, he didn't say this, but like going to Sasser for kick out threes out the gate sounds intentional, right? The way they go to Juwan Roberts to open up the game and get him involved sounds intentional. And he says that Kelvin Sampson and crew work with the post players are very intentional about, hey, we're going to get you involved early, so let's have a plan of action off the jump, right? And once you get those guys involved early, the buy-in starts and you get them all game long. In the most Kelvin Sampson way, though, he says, you don't need 10 post moves. You need 2. Something you're really, really good at and a counter to it. And that thing that Juwan Roberts is really, really good at is putting the defense on his right shoulder and getting that left hook from inside about 5 feet. He's really, really good at that. And the counter is he pump fakes up, gets a guy in the air, and holds the ball down around his chest, but he's like crouched, so it's more like his belly button area, and then goes back over the left hand again once that guy hits the ground off of the pump fake. I'm not saying that you can stop it. I don't know how you stop it because Juwan Roberts is very good at it. But that seems to be very clear, the coaching MO around how they've been coaching Juwan up. There are funny questions about Mardi Gras for both Coach and Juwan Roberts in this availability. I thought hearing Coach Sampson talk about like what is Mardi Gras anyway was interesting because, he's from North Carolina. This didn't really like he's not the most like Bayou Cajun kind of guy. He's kind of learning the culture. He's 10 years in, but he's still learning the culture in a lot of ways. But he was very much like, what are we doing here? What is this? What is this day of excess and everything, right? It was touching to hear Juwan Roberts talk about it being a big party day on an island and a lifestyle that frankly didn't have a whole lot of other things to celebrate like that. It was very heartfelt from Juwan. But I think the funnier thing about Mardi Gras, this complete side note, is every single player in their NIL deal with BB's Texas Orleans Cooking, which you should all go to and support players and tell them that you're going because the UH thing. Tell them this is working because it's a really great deal for them. Apparently, they all ate at BB's at some BB's location today. It didn't look like it was all the same one, but they also all commented. At least the picture of the food. I guess the picture could be older, but with the picture of the food, they said that that's the only place they eat seafood. And I'm not calling shenanigans. There's a lot of really good seafood places in Houston, and if that's the only place they eat seafood, that's as good an endorsement in that city as you can find. So, power to BB's and BB's Texas Orleans Cooking on that one. That's a well-run program. In the more formal media availability, I believe it was Tuesday via Zoom. The little bit that Coach Sampson was able to share about the Tulane game was that it's very evident in watching the film, as I opened up with at the top, that Jalen Cook has the hot hand right now. He's getting over 20 points a game, had 30 as recently as the last game. And, that's the guy to stop. That's the head of the snake to cut off in a lot of ways, right? The majority of the media session, though, very quickly came into this, like, almost philosophical talk about coaching. It's on YouTube, so I'd recommend after this and after your second Locked On listen, maybe go check that out. But there was a lot of talk about, like, coaching his assistant coaches to be head coaches and like giving them responsibilities and delegating, because that's what he saw Coach Popovich do, and that's what that he has so many coaches of color on his staff, and that was what he saw was lacking was coaches like that were always out on the road recruiting and getting these personal relationships with players, but not learning how to be involved in a practice like a head coach. And he's very intentional about teaching those things. I thought it was just interesting to hear that and to talk about like the program as a whole. He talked some about Guy Lewis too, and about how like the program dates back to those days, and we're all just permanently temporary was the phrase he used. Like everyone will always be temporary. It's a program bigger than that. And it was just interesting, like to see this, like for whatever reason, and maybe it's because Temple's opponent that Houston matches up very well with, even though they're very good. But it was interesting to just hear that like this like talk got very philosophical very fast, and it felt like every question after that became a very philosophical coaching question. Just a different angle, I think, than I would have seen coming initially. Now, with all of that said, I do think that it's not like Houston's like looking past Tulane at all. I mean, they are hyping this up, and Coach, if anything, said he's looking past things like Senior Day celebrations. It's like that's not the focus for Sampson. The focus for Sampson is winning the dang basketball game, right? And so he had those kinds of things to say, and it was just an interesting media availability from that perspective. It's always fun to hear Coach Sampson talk, and we're hoping to hear him talk more after Wednesday night's basketball game. It will be a late one. We're hoping to hear him talk more after Wednesday night's basketball game we're hoping to hear it on the post-game show, and we'll be talking about it all week long at Locked On Cougs. We got a lot of stuff to talk about here at Locked On Cougs. We got talk about the Big 12, looks like the Pac-12 may be officially like folding up shop. So like, how does that impact what we're doing? We got Coach Holgerson announcing last weekend that they're not hiring a new offensive coordinator. So what does that mean for them? That was yesterday's episode. We'll have a post-game show on Thursday morning after the Wednesday night basketball game. And we got big games of the weekend, too, to preview against East Carolina in basketball. All kinds of fun stuff happening at Locked On Cougs this week. So make sure you follow me at Painsworth512. That's PAINSWORTH512 for all things Cougar. Football, basketball, Rockets, Astros. I got a sneaker wall behind me. Whatever you want to talk about, you find me at Painsworth512 on all of your various social media handles. PAINSWORTH512. Thank you all so much for subscribing and listening to the show today. Remember, we're giving away a Letterman jacket at $750, so make sure you subscribe and comment down below. Give us a thumbs up to let us know you did it. If you're looking for a second listen of the day, I'm going to recommend Locked On College Basketball because there's a lot of Big 12 action on Tuesday night. There's other big like implications and some Alabama stuff going on in basketball on Tuesday. And so they're covering all those kinds of things. Locked On College Basketball. I'm going to recommend you go hear about our next conference. and some chaos happening across the country in that show. Thank you all so much for tuning in to Locked on Cougs. Locked on Cougs is a proud member of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team, or in our case, the number one team in the country, every day. Go Cougs!